Okay. All right. Thanks, Kirsten. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining. Glad you're all here. If anybody's heard me talk about Zero Trust or has participated in our working group, I talk a lot about data, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The two gentlemen that I'll introduce here today have drafted a white paper, and I think it focuses on a part of Zero Trust that I'm very passionate about, which is data. And you know, if anybody's heard me, like I said, I talk about data a lot when I talk about Zero Trust, and I'm that inside out kind of person. Start with the data and work your way back to the identity. I was actually participating in a roundtable the other day where, you know, I was, you know, they said, where would you start? And I said, well, I'll start with the data. If that's what I'm trying to protect, where is it? What is it? And where's it going? What's normal look like with regards to my data? And of course, somebody across from the table argued with me. I think it's about the identity. Well, I said, well, if your account is, if my account is compromised and you're the cybersecurity analyst, I said, what's the first question you're probably going to ask? He said, well, what did you have access to? And was there exfil? I said, yes, that's about the data. That's not about me anymore. That's about the data. So definitely got his head scratching and starting to nod, like starting to get it, which was very interesting. But the two gentlemen today, we have the honor of meeting. First, I'll introduce Mark Emery. Mark's has quite a career. He's led shaped a wide variety of technological organizations. He is part of the Emery Group, the founder of the Emery Group. They have interests that include a lot of disruption in counter drone detection and mitigation, data-centric zero trust cybersecurity and data rights management, supply chain risk management, water purification solutions, and AI for virtual job coaching, just to name a few. He worked for the Department of Homeland Security, where he was a senior executive. He managed a $400 million portfolio at one time while he was there, did a lot of integrations, has had a lot of notoriety, as well as one time he won the JD Power Quality Award for some of his work. He serves on the Information Technology Executive Council for the Cottage School of American University. He also serves in AFCEA's Homeland Security Committee, and as well as a slew of other things. I'd probably take up the whole time today to read his whole bio by word. But we also have the honor of meeting Mr. Gary Connor today, who is a retired brigadier general in the U.S. Air Force. He brings over 31 years of experience in program management and senior executive leadership from his Air Force days. His last executive assignment was deputy program manager for the $8 billion a year ballistic missile defense system in Huntsville, Alabama. Since retiring, he's served as an aerospace industry consultant, providing strategy and implementation. He's recognized and well-respected systems thinker, and he offers specific in-depth expertise in large-scale program management, enterprise management, strategic planning, logistics information, complex systems and integration. So Gary is also one that I would probably take up the whole session to read his bio, but two very distinguished gentlemen that I'm happy to have join us here today and tell us a little bit about their white paper. And with that, I will turn it over to you guys to give your presentation, and then we'll follow up with question and answer. During the presentation, if you think of a question, you want to go ahead and put it in the chat. And once they have concluded their presentations, we'll go through some of those questions and ask them at the end of the presentation. So with that, gentlemen, I will turn it over to you.
Jerry, this is Gary Connor. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Mark? Uh-oh.
He's still sharing, so.
I'll try chatting him on the side.
Okay.
While she's doing that, Gary, do you want to give a little, how you guys came about to drafting this paper in the first place? What
Sure.
prompted it?
And one other data point on my resume, Jerry, that I want to highlight that is highly relevant, I think, to this particular topic, besides the systems thinking pieces. During 2006, I was the warfighting CIO in Iraq, so I had the opportunity of enabling and ensuring the operation of a warfighting network in all domains, which was kind of interesting for an Air Force guy being in charge of an all Army comm organization during a shooting war. So Mark and I came to this over the period of, I'd say, the last couple of years that it culminated in this white paper, where we were working with various clients and also various companies who each had their own special widget, if you will. And Mark and I almost simultaneously came to the same conclusion that, well, it really is first and foremost about the data. And when you think about all of the different activities that have gone on, and we'll see some of this in the presentation, a lot of activity with regard to cyber implementation, defense in depth, layered defenses, but they always seem to treat or deal with data as sort of an afterthought or the last thing. So Mark and I thought, well, why don't we put our thoughts together? And Mark was actually the brainchild for this. I was just adding color commentary and editing efforts to pull together this white paper to sort of crystallize that thought process. And the release of the zero trust architectures of late, and everybody has one, also provided some impetus for us to put our thoughts on paper and help crystallize, okay, if you're going to embark upon a zero trust implementation approach, where would you start?
And Gary, that's very great. I was going to say, I think we have to owe our introduction to Barry Lyons, who may be a person who a lot of people in the audience know as well. He's been in the data security and continuous monitoring world, security world for quite a long time.
Yes. Yeah.
But,
Barry a lot.
Yeah, I'll just say my thanks again, since I was on mute the first time. Gary, thank you very much for the introduction, as Gary said, and Kirsten and Tom for hosting us. Our goal today really is to stimulate conversation. We've been talking up zero trust we've been talking up data protection even before we ever heard of zero trust. And because we thought that was one of the largest gaps in the whole cybersecurity framework and efforts people were doing. It was sort of always there. It's in the CDM work plan. It used to be part of phase 4, which unfortunately the CDM team never got to. And it's also, sort of mentioned in 800-207 that you're doing all this stuff to protect the data, but quite a bit of it only talks about protecting the network and some of the applications and devices and identity around the data. So we just felt that data really needed its own advocate. So that's what we're out here for, and to make sure that there's that people really know that that's really where we believe you have to start with this. So Gary, if you would please carry on and talk about why we some of the reasons we think that.
Sure. Well, next chart, if you would. So there's a couple of charts that we're going to reveal here. And some of you may have personal firsthand experience with some of these breaches. The code here is the magnitude of the data breach and the date that it occurred. And this chart actually is 2 years old. We haven't updated it to reflect all the breaches in the last couple of years. But this is the government breach club. And then the next chart is the commercial breach club. And what the purpose of this is to emphasize the point that all of the headlines that we see with regard to breaches are focused on the data. You don't hear folks, you don't see big headlines like number of passwords compromised in the DHS or the number of credentials that were stolen. Now that may be a fifth page or a back page story if it ever makes the newspaper, because it's always about the data. And so it strikes me and struck Mark and I as interesting that the headlines are always focused on the data, but our efforts are not focused first on protecting the data. And then for those of you who are CrowdStrike fans, the reference to this particular report is at the footnote at the bottom of the chart. But according to CrowdStrike, ransomware attacks exploded in the number and scale in 2021. And the expectation is that pace is going to continue unabated. 82% increase in ransomware attacks. And you'll see some things about credentials here, and the credential favoring crowd will say, see, that's right, you got to attack the credentials. Well, back to Jerry's point, they go after the credentials because they want to get at your data. So if you take the thought that your data are your crown jewels, then from the bad guys' perspective, they want to steal them. And from the good guys' perspective, we want to protect them.
Yeah. And Barry, a couple of points I'd like to make here. In the first bullet, you stressed that it's resulted in data leaks, related data leaks. You know, most people think of ransomware as they lock up my data and I can't use it, and therefore I can't operate my business. And that's certainly true. But of late, it's been more the taking that data and threatening to expose your sensitive information to the outside world as sort of a new form of that ransom, so that not only will you can't operate your business, but they're going to embarrass your business. The other thing that I'd like to point out here is that they note that since a lot of people are moving their applications to the cloud, they're now starting to target the cloud providers in their basic infrastructure so that they can collect data from and threaten the operations of people who use cloud operations. And I like to go back and quote Tom DiBiase at ELC in Philadelphia a few years ago, that he said you can't outsource your security. Just because you put all your applications in someone else's data center, the cloud, you're still responsible for making sure you take care of that data.
Yeah, absolutely right. So if the focus is on the data, then the next question is, well, where is all my data and how is it being used? Data is integral to the mission operations for the agency or the organization. And how that data is used is integral to the folks that are executing those mission operations and using the data for mission purposes. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the head of the agency or the CEO is ultimately accountable and responsible for mission success and mission failure. And with data being integral to that, putting data at the top of the priority with regard to protection makes perfect sense from our perspective. This also suggests that you should take a program approach to how you implement your zero trust program, with it starting with data first. And when you do that, then you start to organize for combat, and you start to begin to put in place the good order and discipline with regard to cost, schedule, and performance, measures of effectiveness, and return on investment. And we'll talk a little bit about return on investment and operational benefits as a result of taking that approach. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I emphasize that too. When I was a deputy CIO at Homeland Security, we had the most success when we partnered with the mission owners. If it was just about saving money on infrastructure by combining onto one network, that was a nice thing to do. It was a good thing to do. Ultimately, it paid off with an ROI, but the mission owners didn't particularly care about that because their network was still working. It wasn't their budget. But the data is something that they own. And when we were able to partner with the mission owners to figure out how we serve them best across the whole agency, how we share data, and how we do that that benefits each of the program offices, we were most successful in partnering with them. In this chart here, I want to emphasize this is a very notional look at ROI. I don't have any real world dollars and cents on a lot of this stuff, but based on our survey of different, presentations we've seen, papers that have been written about zero trust, or how to do zero trust from different vendors' points of view. If you're a network vendor, you have one point of view. If you're an identity vendor, you have another. But this sort of, I'll call her Gary and I as panel of experts, our point of view of when you start your zero trust program, that these are the kind of relationships between the investments required and the results you get for those investments. And ROI in this case might be measured in terms of how do you value, a data loss, how much data loss you've prevented, or how much lost time do your employees have for remediating the data loss, or actually not being able to work. It could be in terms of the mission, it could be, threats to the homeland. Because I've lost data, now I'm, X%, more likely to not be able to make good decisions. If my data has been corrupted, how do I know that I'm letting the right person through the port of entry, that I have their data correct? Or maybe if my data is corrupted, I might have been spoofed on that. So, it's those mission outcomes is what we should be measuring. There are certainly key service indicators for how we do on, the specific things the IT roles will do in the program. But the real outcome is what dollars did we save? How did we improve the mission? Can we tie what we're doing to that mission? And how long did it take us to achieve those benefits with the least amount of operational impact on our end users? And it's our point of view that if you look at the 5 pillars in the foundation, your best relative ROI, and I use this in quotes, ROI, is the data pillar. It's not expensive to implement. It gets the most bang for the buck for the mission. It can be done quickly, and it can be done with relatively little impact on users, as opposed to the other extreme. Trying to implement zero trust in the network by microsegmentation is a long-term project. It's going to be very expensive. There's a lot of modernization has to be done. And at the end of the day, it's, the network has, there's ways to mediate in the networks. There's alternatives, there's redundancies you can put in that, some of the cyber attacks that come in through the network, which I assume is already breached. If I protect my data, I don't care if it's breached or not. So, this is the way we look at this from a programmatic point of view, and, relative types of benefits that we would get from and cost. So, just to summarize on this slide, I really want to emphasize the point. Most things out in the public domain do not emphasize data. They emphasize the other pillars. So, in some ways, looking at data first is very disruptive to the way people think about their stovepipes. It's also innovative because you look at the CDM program, you look at the OMB memorandum, you look at the framework. It's from left to right. Data is always the last on the thing here. And what I'd love to do is to see that framework turned around and put data first. It's first among equals. They're all important. We're not saying don't do these other things at the appropriate time, but it's first among all these equals. And it can be done in a way that we've seen in real world use cases that you can actually get started with the budget you have. Because if you implement the data pillar correctly in an effective way, you can actually turn off some of your current data protection systems that are very scattered and in stovepipes. So if you pull all that budget together under one program, you can control it, and then you can direct your money towards new modern investments in data protection that maybe weren't available to people over the last 10 years. But you're still paying for those implementations, and there's money to be saved there by implementing some of the later technologies that are available. Gary, you want to say anything about that, or should I go on and let you talk about implementation?
Yeah, I think we can move to implementation, Mark. So we talked about an integrated program. Many of you who are CIOs or CISOs or have been working in this business for a while probably suffer from the some assembly required approach to trying to pull together all of your enterprise capabilities in a coherent fashion, and doing the best you can with the budget you have and the capabilities that are dropped in your lap. What this is intended to convey is a data stewardship model that provides a degree of integration that we haven't seen folks talk about up to this point. But we're aware of capabilities and platforms out there that actually do this type of capability. So if you start from left to right, first you got to figure out where your data is at, and it's in a variety of different formats and it's a variety of different locations. You've got to classify it, and classification is from not only a CUI, but from a healthcare or a PII perspective, and it's got to be interoperable with the Microsoft capabilities that are out there today. Then you've got to protect it with quantum resistant, that should say resistant, not safe, quantum resistant encryption wherever the data resides. Imagine, if you will, the ability to protect a data payload wherever it is at and only allow that payload to be opened by the people who are authorized to use it. Now think about that for just a minute, because now you can avoid two types of things that CIOs and CISOs worry about. First is the bad actors who are inside your network who exfiltrate it or steal it, or what I refer to as the stupid human tricks, where somebody accidentally sends a data element to somebody who shouldn't really have that. And you could think PII, but it could be worse. In each of those cases, because they are not authorized to have access to it, the payload remains encrypted with quantum resistant encryption. So only the access, going back to Jerry's point, only the access enables the unlocking of the data. And then you have data access policy and orchestration, where you take those three things across the top, and now you synchronize and integrate those to affect the types of protections that you want to achieve. And then on the far left at the bottom, you have reporting that helps you visualize how the data is being used, not only by the users, but by the systems. And it also alerts you when exceptions occur, so you can take immediate action with regard to closing that exception. And then at the bottom, you see policy automation, orchestration, workflow reporting, corrective action, using AI and machine learning capabilities to automate all of the things that happen in this continuous learning, continuous data stewardship model. And we use the term data stewardship purposely because we believe that first and foremost, you need to understand who owns the data, because the data owner, and I'll use the finance folks as an example, they should decide first what data should be protected, and second, who should have access or not have access to that data. And this type of a framework through automation would enable the finance data steward to know when the data is being used properly, how it needs to be adjusted because of the nature of the workflow and the nature of the business changes, and when exceptions occur, how to swoop in and immediately address those exceptions. Mark?
Yeah, and Gary, this looks like nirvana to me. It's certainly visionary if you had an organization that was mature enough to be in this OODA loop and doing all this. And certainly when we have been out over the last several years talking to CISOs and CIOs and chief data officers, it continuously comes up that and we talk about them, that these tools are available. They're like skeptical because they've never been exposed to it. I've heard people say in conferences, I wouldn't know where to start. I don't even know where my data is. So, and then also, I don't know who should have permission to that data. Our LAN is, if you're on our LAN, then you can get to any data that's there. There's nothing to, we don't deny access to anybody because we're not, we thought if we did, we create a denial service attack on our own employees. And the tools that are available, particularly if they provide the right kind of reporting, if you go through this, as you implement the finding, as Gary said, if you put the classification marking on and you protect it, then when you report on that, you're going to start getting an immediate flow of data that's available for your mission data owner to decide, hey, there's 5,000 people that are using my data at least once a week. But there's a whole nother 200,000 that never do it. Why am I giving those 200,000 access to my data? Let's turn them off and see what happens. So you go in, you tweak a policy, and now only the people you know who use your data are using it. With that, you have this continuous feedback loop where you can implement that without disrupting your enterprise operations. And I think that's what is the beauty about thinking through this, about how you get from where you are today to where they go. And I think it's probably one of the things Gary and I are working on next is how to publish this as like a playbook. I think GSA and others are looking at putting in zero trust playbooks. I think this could be the heart of one of them, and I hope we can help them with that. So our last slide, and we can all just talk about the questions people have, Gary, right?
Sure.
So, with focusing on the data pillar, you can get these short-term wins that'll reduce the risk you have of data loss in your environment. You'll be well on your way to zero trust. You'll get immediate visibility. You'll get real time implementation. You'll be able to adapt your policy in real time and improve that user experience. It's all this is there to be done. Again, Gary, you and I have seen some of our clients who've implemented this, and they've gotten these kind of results. And I think that government agencies can do that as well.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Mark, that this is a combination of not only the technology, but also the practices and procedures and policies as implemented by the organization. And if you go back to that infinity diagram that we presented earlier, it's a continuous learning process with regard to not only the application of the technology for persistent data protection, but the implementation of the technology inside the organization's mission and business flows as used by your applications and by the people. And like it says on the back of the shampoo bottle, rinse and repeat. And so you're continuously adjusting based on the mission needs and the people's needs, but at the same time persistently protecting that data.
Very cool. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm not sharing my screen anymore. I think I have video now.
Yep. There you are.
Hey, in all its glory, I'm actually not just a
Not just a, you really
robot.
are a pretty face.
Now a slew of people are joining all of a sudden. So Mark, I think we got a few questions and comments in the chat, Mark and Gary. The first one I got is, if the data is decentralized and owned by the system owners in legacy and proprietary formats, then how would this model work when the CIO does not own or control the data structures and mechanisms?
Yeah, that's sort of our point. Is that's why it's not. I don't believe this is a CIO program. As Gary said before, this is really the head of the agency's program. And if it's like enterprise architecture. Even though the CIO is responsible for it, the mission owners have the business model. They have the workflows. They own the data. So if I were the CIO, I'd be thinking real hard about turning this program over to my enterprise architect, not as a documentation program, but as somebody who understands where that data is, what systems it's affected with, as opposed to somebody who's just focused on a single system or a single network. You really have to, and they're going to be able to talk to the mission owners. They've already have that relationship with the data owners. So that partnership between enterprise architecture, the chief data officer, and the mission owners. And it will take all the multiple programs. It's no different than, you don't have one person to go to be your product owner when you're doing agile development. You've got multiple systems, multiple product owners. It's absolutely no different.
So to sharpen that answer, if I could, Mark, let's use the finance organization. Yep. So the CFO would be the data owner. The CFO would decide who should have access to the financials for the enterprise. And that's both a people and a business systems conversation. And the CFO would be enabled by the tools that allows them to not only protect the data persistently, but also grant the access based on what the CFO needs. Also, the CFO would get the feedback as they're executing to say, well, wait a minute, I need to give Johnny or Susie access because of XYZ, and they change the permissions, or I need to close this off for whatever reason. So that's part of the continuous learning and continuous feedback. And there's going to be synchronized swimming at the executive level and at the data owner level, because mission applications integrate data from various lanes, if you will. I hope, Ms. Hahn, that we addressed your question.
Yeah, I hear you guys. So you're saying the people and the processes part is easier to deal with than the technology? Did I get that right?
Nope, I would not ever suggest that. If it weren't for the darn people, this place would run just fine, right? Where have you heard that before? So
that's where I'm going with the data.
But
the data is owned by the people. Yeah, if I could fire all the people, I wouldn't have a problem, right? So,
right. But this is about training folks in the discipline of how the data is used as a part of an enterprise. So you were enabling good behaviors and good enterprise behaviors for the people in the execution of those business processes, while simultaneously protecting the data from accidents or theft.
And I would argue that the tools today are smart enough to know which data should be protected in what circumstances and which not. So you don't have to train every end user on which data is sensitive. I mean, everybody knows PHI or PII, but they don't, how many people know that an address, is from somebody, an employee's address, or, things like that. And, you innocently send a note out, an email out that contains a file of employee addresses because people want to send crowd Christmas cards. Well, that could be a training issue, but if you put in the right technology, it'll recognize that attachment of addresses or that email has PII in it, and it will protect that data so that only an authorized person can see that a third party wouldn't be able to see that kind of data. So the idea is with automation is that you don't have to train your people as much, because in the background, you're taking that burden off of them to make that decision one at a time, because it's done by policy.
And the large scale organizations who have implemented this successfully have piloted it on a smaller scale to actually take both the technology and the policy implementation for a test drive to determine the interaction and the effectiveness of both. And once they've decided, hey, this is scalable, this will work, and they build their own playbooks, then they scale it up. And we have experience with 350,000 person organizations who implemented a capability like this very quickly, and are protecting critical data critical to their mission.
So I think that kind of segues to the next question that's in the chat is that the gentleman says, I agree and often see the biggest problem is to find, classify, and identify rights to data. Have you guys successfully performed those tasks, or can you point to or people that have done it that you've worked with, for example?
Yeah, we can point to some references in the commercial world that have done it. The other place is at DARPA. They're in the middle of their journey, and while they're doing using some of these tools at a classified level, their problem's even harder. They've got to restrict access to data on a program by program basis.
Yep.
And so they've gone through that effort. It's in a lot of ways, if you think about data classification, it used to be 3 classes: secret, top secret, and FOUO, or nothing. And so we built these physical networks around those data classifications, and we've got top secret networks, we've got secret networks, and then we got everything else. Well, that everything else still contains tons and tons of mission sensitive data. Email itself, I've had CIOs tell me that email is their most high value asset. They couldn't run their business without email. And so you have to be able to look at not just 3 tiers of applications, which you can do with physical networks, but with data protection, you can actually segment your data down to the passenger screening program at CBP doesn't need to, if I'm in that program, I don't need to be sharing that with all of CBP. I only need to be sharing it with the people who are in that program with me, even though it's not classified, but it is sensitive. And so you limit the risk by limiting access.
Next one has got 2 questions. The first one is, can you re-explain the difference between data pillar versus microsegmentation? And then the second question is, let's say we're locked down to per user group access. So who's the authority to grant permissions?
I'll take 2 if you take 1, Mark.
Okay, well, I've been known to say that data protection is the ultimate in microsegmentation. Although it doesn't, if it doesn't do anything to harm somebody doing mischief to the quote network itself. But as Gary said before, while the data may be generated by a program, it's used by many programs. Systems interface with multiple programs. So data is used and reused. It's transported. It's formed. It never stays in one place. And so just because you lock down a segment which has my application in it doesn't mean my data is protected when I've shared it with somebody else. How do I know that they've locked it down? Other than I have an MOU with them that says they will do X, Y, and Z. It's a compliance issue. But if I'm the data owner, I want to own that from cradle to grave. And if I'm the person who grants access to that data, no matter what system uses it, no matter what person on that system uses it, then I am in control until that data is no longer needed, no longer valuable, can be archived, put away, of who and what and how that data is to be consumed.
And all of that is automated, right? So once you establish those policies and those relationships, both system-wise and access-wise, it becomes automated. And that's a great segue to the second question. So if you're locked down and you're trying to determine who gets access and who makes those decisions. So in this framework, you have a data steward who decides what data gets controlled and who has access. Now the system automates that. So let's say somebody in the group decides to send data to somebody outside the group. 2 things will happen. The first is the person who is sending the information, actually 3 things. The person who's sending the information will get a notice that says from the system, did you mean to send that to Susie? Because she doesn't have access. Okay. Susie will get the payload, but she can't open it because she hasn't been granted access. And the system administrator will be notified that there's an exception that may need adjudication. So now the person sending it, and I'll use Tom as an example. Tom sending it says, oops, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. No harm, no foul, because the payload is in Susie's inbox. He can either retrieve it, ask her to delete it, but she can't open it, right? The other is Tom can be granted one-time exception keys by the system that will allow Susie to have access to that payload for that one-time purpose. All the while, the system administrator is monitoring this to see, is this an exception we need to close an issue with because we have a potential problem? Or is this an exception that requires me to change the policy because I need to open up the aperture and expand or change the access permissions? So In every one of those scenarios, access is controlled, a payload is controlled, and the humans are in the loop, actually on the loop, with regard to the decision-making required to either restrict or expand the data access aperture. I hope that helps answer number 2.
Yeah, and I don't want to go on a tangent, but the only thing I would add to the whole thing is that that's only one factor, is, you know, the access part. You know, how are they authentication? What type of device? What kind of tolerance do you have for all of these other factors that add into that determine, all right, does this person actually ultimately get access? Do they get full access? Are they able to edit? Can they just download? Can they print? All kinds of things like that. So I think
Well,
there's
that's
other factors that play in.
That's a
to
great
give
point,
access.
Jerry. And to be complete, those system implementations and those policies that you described would be integrated as a part
Yep.
of that total data access, data protection.
Right.
I mean, these are simple examples, but if you go back to that other chart, the infinity diagram, think of those systems being integrated and the policies being integrated to affect the data access per your policy.
Yeah, we got to get out of that kind of Active Directory mindset. You belong to
Yeah.
this group, you get this kind of thing.
Right.
Well,
Next, oh,
And
sorry, Mike.
instead of, you know, user groups, I guess there's also the term of security groups, but the you know, the tools that are out there today, the available information to the policy enforcement point are the things you mentioned, Jerry.
Yep.
The location of the device. Is it inside my firewall? Is it outside my firewall? Is it, you know, unfortunately, it's, you know, IP addresses can be spoofed. So, you know, you have to even take that with a grain of salt. Was multi-factor authentication used? You know, that information is readily available for the policy enforcement point to use that in the decision-making process.
Next question I have is, any recommendations on classification schemas? CUI seems viable, but curious to your insights.
Let's see, how many classification or marking schemas do you have to deal with? It seems like the curve is going like this. I had this conversation with somebody the other day where we were talking about this in the context of a supply chain, where you're a company who has multiple contracts, maybe cutting across multiple markets, and now you are in CUI hell because you have to administer multiple markings just in those lanes, and then forget about the cross company conversations with the same people working across all those contracts. And how do you keep that straight? So, I mean, there are classification tools out there that, and it's not Microsoft MIP, and you know, Microsoft has a great platform, but classification is not their strong suit. And you rapidly run out of classification schemas with MIP. And so we can talk off camera. There's some folks who've got, I would argue, world leaders in multiple classification schemas, flexible classification schemas, which are integrated with the Microsoft platform that make it easy for your people to classify and mark things connected with a discovery product.
Yeah, can I follow up with that one? Hey, Mark.
Hey, James.
How's it doing?
Good, James. Follow up.
Yeah, so we got CUI. We know it comes with the various different sets and the different specificities. But what about, you know, I speak to peers at Microsoft quite often. They have about 5 labels, you know, confidential, public, internal, etc. Speaking with Gartner, they say keep it simple. If you go more than 6 labels, you're doomed for failure.
Mm-hmm.
Then we got so many options. How do we keep it simple but still meet the mission of, you know, with the topic of today's conversation?
Right.
Well, yeah, and I keep it simple. Stupid is always my motto I love to use, but it really depends on what your mission is. You know, James, you're at OPM. I know you have CUI that you share with contractors, but you know, you really have, you know, PII is your biggest source of sensitive information. You know, you might think about how you start there, because I think you're going to find that it's not where when you go looking for it, when you go discover where that PII is, you're going to be surprised at how many individual home drives have PII in them. And
Yes.
should they? If I was a bank, and this happened at JP Morgan Chase, they bought a financial services processor, and they went and used a discovery tool to find out what sensitive data was out there, and they were focused on things to satisfy their regulatory needs, their financial information, and they found 300 million records on people's home drives of credit card numbers. They had to remediate that immediately because they were in violation of could have been liable to fines and things like that could have been really disruptive after doing that acquisition. So really, I would start with your mission owners to find make that decision and help you with that decision. But if you just want to test the technology, I think CUI is a perfect place because it should be very contained. You could be working with your contracts folks and people doing procurements, and you could start with that CUI data right off the bat for controlling that. And I know that's a big issue. CMMC's out there in the DoD, they're dealing with it. DHS is starting to deal with CUI because I know they've had some exposure with some of their data breaches that came through contractors. So maybe CUI is a good place to do too. You get to clean up not only your own data, but you get to clean up your industry data as well, to your industrial base as well at the same time.
And James, just one other postscript on that, the capability I was referring to, they've taken a very elegant approach by integrating into the existing Microsoft metadata, the classification and markings. So wherever that data goes, the metadata goes with it, and it's easily discoverable or exposable or markable by virtue of that metadata tagging. And I'd be happy to chat with you off camera about that if there's further interest.
It is. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, next question, and then it's followed by a comment. So have you done any market research of tools that can help accomplish what you're presenting here today? Also, please note that traditional microsegmentation is expensive/challenging. However, host-based microsegmentation is not expensive/challenging and is very much complementary to an implementation that you describe.
Yes, I've been doing market research on this since 2005. When I first read an article in the Harvard Business Review where one of the professors there was arguing that, and this was back, 17 years ago, we'll never close all the holes in our firewalls. We'll never be able to, guard a castle and moat. We have to find a way for the data to protect itself. And I thought, that's it. That's exactly what we want to do, is protect the data itself. But the technology just wasn't there. You didn't have the computing power. You didn't have the standards. You didn't have the cloud. So it's like the perfect storm that comes together. We're in a great time to implement this, where we maybe couldn't have it. 5 or 10. I would even say 5 years ago, you would have been hard pressed to do it as well as it's possible now with the tools that are out there. And there's any number of tools that do classification or do discovery or do encryption. And there are maybe 1 or 2 that I would call platforms that pull that all together onto a single pane of glass, so that you're not going out and discovering and then now I know where my data, I know what data is where, now I have to classify it. Oh, but I just classified it and I got to go back out and rediscover it because I may have I didn't know what I was looking for the first time. And then you go back and say, well, while you were out there, why didn't you protect it? And okay, now I got to go run an encryption program to protect it. So, our recommendation is that you do discovery, classification, protection as best you can in one fell swoop. Don't do them in stovepipes.
Yep. Yeah, and the platforms that Mark is referring to will integrate with other enterprise capabilities. So it's not like it's a forklift upgrade that you have to pursue, but it does put priority on that discover, classify, and protect. And if you take a data first approach, it's also architecture agnostic. So it doesn't matter what architecture you implement, to include cloud
Right.
or hybrid cloud.
So Mark, I'm gonna forgive you for saying that the saying that I hate, single pane of glass. I'll give you a pass on this one.
Oh, okay.
Next question. Everybody uses it. Most data access authorization is within applications. How does that work in this context that you guys are talking about?
So the reality is that once you have access to the application, you have access to all the data. That doesn't mean you should have. Let me give you an example, customer support desk. This could be a commercial, a lot of service desks that U.S. citizens use in the federal government, but the frontline person on the service desk, customer calls in, a citizen calls in, and they bring up their record. Okay, everybody has all the customer records are in one file because we've successfully gone to a customer-centric view in all of our applications and databases. We don't have customers in all different places anymore, right? But best practice is, you have a customer-centric model of your data. And so now I've got all this information about the customer. Do I need all that information just because I have access to the application? So if I'm trying to validate that you're eligible, you are the employee who you say you are, I'm going to ask you for your social security number or some other identifying information. On my screen, maybe I only need to see the last 4 digits. I want to mask, or either want to transfigurate that data so that it looks like a real social security number, or it's not, or I just want to mask it. And if I verify the last 4 digits, that's good enough. But if I'm have a question and they want to go talk to my supervisor, maybe my supervisor as a user of that same system should be allowed to see the whole social security number or the whole credit card number, because that's how they're going to deal with, fixing the customer's problem, the citizen's problem, that they want to do that. So again, depending upon who you are, if I'm an internal investigator from ICE or a fraud investigator from HHS, and I probably need rights to all the data. But certainly the person who at CMS who's granting the rights to somebody to have Medicare, doesn't have to have all that data all the time available to them. So even if you guaranteed access to the application, you have to refine that down to a level. The second, to down to the field level, which can be done. The second thing is, even though that application has access to that data, I can guarantee you that same data is going to show up in other places other than just that application. People are going to run BI reports, and they're going to, it's like the case I mentioned of the financial services company. They, was somebody in telemarketing who ran a report that said, we want to call these customers. And it downloaded the data from the database and it had all this financial data in it. If somebody does that to your employee payroll system, they're going to get a lot of data that they maybe shouldn't have, and it gets copied into Excel, it gets passed around, it's emailed from place to place. The data is never at rest; it's always moving. If you don't put the protection with the data, you're going to find you're going to lose control of it.
And one postscript on that comment, Mark, is there's an implied thought here that you have perfect knowledge of how your mission applications operate and integrate with the business and mission flows associated with the end-to-end activities of your enterprise. And one of the things that you will discover when you put a capability like this in place is you're really going to understand how your mission applications are using your data. Because I would contend without the forensic capability to really peel that back, you really truly don't understand how your enterprise is processing your data end to end across its mission applications.
Good point, Gary.
Sorry about that. Answer was given earlier. There was mention of granting one-time access to a user. Are there practical means of limiting users to one-time access? Once a valid user is granted access, that user could save, copy, forward data, resulting in loss of control.
Yes. In fact, there's a particular use case for a platform that we're familiar with for a DoD agency where we have presented them with an approach to solve that problem for both the print copy save challenge, so that they did not lose control of the data, and those rights were restricted. And it was a combination of integration of this platform with some Microsoft capabilities. And I think it was, let me scroll up here. I think it was Dr. Abrams who asked that question. Dr. Abrams, would be happy to take that conversation with you offline so we could elaborate on the specifics of that particular use case. But there is an approach to address your concern directly.
Yeah, hi, Mark. A very, very insightful question. You're starting to get an area which I call data rights management, which is a fine-grained control of how you want to let people use the data, and that there are some challenges in there, as every security system has, and we believe that an example Gary's talking about, that we've probably met 90 to 95% of the challenges there.
So, gentlemen, I think we're coming up on time, and I think that just about exhausts the questions that came up in the chat. I'll open it up if there's one more. Comment is, and who is what is accessing that data? There's also authorization-based access control, which I hadn't mentioned, ABAC.
You know, I've been struggling with the concept of ABAC versus RBAC, other than that there's two different first letters. They're sort of the same process, but the ABAC uses a lot more information. So, you know, most people in role-based access, if I'm denoted as a customer service rep, every customer service rep has the same right. But I believe in the zero trust, and I certainly agree with this. Knowledge about, you know, this customer service rep is assigned to the midnight to 8 o'clock shift. That person should only see data that's relevant to that shift. If all of a sudden I start seeing that person at noon, and I compare that to the timesheet schedule that they're scheduled to work midnight to 8, then I shouldn't grant them access. That's an example to me of authorization-based access control, and that's you know, very reasonable to try to implement in a data protection scheme.
More granular and tied to the actual digital identity of the individual user or system, rather than a group concept. And we know, you know, my years of Active Directory, group membership can get very messy, and sometimes you're granting, you know, you're adding somebody to the group when you're inadvertently giving them more access than that they may need, because you intended to give them access to one thing and they get access to something else as a result of being part of that group and perpetually part of that group. So yeah, definitely. I think that exhausts the questions. Well, gentlemen, good session, a lot of good question and answer. I'm sure that if anybody has any further questions for each of you, that you're willing to take any calls or reach out. I really appreciate the time. I definitely, you know, part of the subject of zero trust that I'm very passionate about is the data. So I thank you for the white paper, as well as agreeing to come talk to us today about this.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity, Jerry, and good luck with the continuing work of the working group of Zero Trust. I understand integration and actual demonstration in the lab is one of the things you guys are going to do, and I look forward to seeing the results of that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And you know, we're having a little chat, and I'll just unveil it here to this group. So we're going to start reconvening once a month outside of the demos, at least with the government membership. So those of you that are part of that, or do want to be part of our working group with ATARC, definitely reach out to us. and we'll be starting monthly and start talking about the EO and some of the other things that we want to do as well as, excuse me, I have trouble late in the day getting my words out, demoing integrated labs and what that might look like, as well as bringing some people in for best practices. I know we have one of the gentlemen here on the team from GSA. We're probably going to see if they're willing to come in and talk about the playbook that they're developing that a lot of people are contributing to. So a lot of good things coming up with the working group. So, but again, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a good evening.
Most welcome. And Jerry, when you have that ATARC session on the single pane of glass, would you please extend an invitation to us?
I won't be scheduling it very soon.
Thanks,
All right, sir.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, take care.
Have a good night.
You
You
too.
too.
Bye-bye.